This is Living Legacy. I'm Tom Morrow, your host. Today we're talking with Doug Brown, a Army helicopter pilot veteran and going to be a new resident here in Oceanside. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, you were a Marine brat. Your dad was in the Marine Corps?
I was a Marine Corps brat born at Great Lakes Naval Station.
And what year was that?
1950, long time ago.
Yeah, that was right in the middle of, well, right when the Korean War started.
You bet.
Did Dad have to go to Korea?
He did. He went to Korea about a year and a half after my birth. He spent a year or more there and came back, and my younger brother had been born. So the two of us got to see Dad. We were living in the D.C. area at the time.
What was your dad's MOS?
My dad was a commo officer. So he worked in communications, and that seemed to be the thread of what he did for the rest of his life. The Marines set the stage for him.
Was he a Mustang?
Yes, he was.
Yeah, he started as enlisted.
Absolutely.
Now, where did you go to high school?
Edison High School, Fairfax County, Virginia.
Yeah. And what year did you graduate?
1968, an interesting time.
Yeah, I was going to say things were heating up in Vietnam. Really, that was right in the middle of everything.
Right in the middle of my senior year in high school was the Tet Offensive. Changed the attitudes of everybody at that time.
Yeah.
So a very interesting time, you bet.
So you joined the Army right out of high school?
I spent a year before I enlisted in the Army. I'd found out during that time about a wonderful program called the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program, where a high school graduate could pass the test and become a warrant officer and a helicopter pilot and serve their time in Vietnam and in the military that way.
But being a warrant officer in a helicopter was a little bit better than being a grunt on the ground.
It was a different environment for sure during that time.
However, it got to be pretty dangerous.
It depended on what you were flying.
And what were you flying?
I flew a little aircraft that they made in Southern California in Culver City, Hughes Aircraft, the Hughes 500, which was the OH-6 helicopter, the light observation helicopter. They test flew that aircraft here at Palomar Airport.
I was going to say they did some finishing touches.
Absolutely they did. And anybody who saw those test flights down here, I'd love to know who they are, because it had to have been one of the most interesting test flights there ever was for a low-level recon helicopter.
Yeah. Now, what unit were you? Where did you take basic and flight training?
I got basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Oh, wonderful place.
Oh, great place. Great place. But for jungle warfare training, it's not a bad thing to do. Yeah. Little practice E&Eing, I guess.
Yeah.
That's escape and evade.
Yeah.
They then drove us up the road to a place called Fort Walters, Texas, about 90 miles west of Fort Worth. And they had another Hughes aircraft out there, the 300, that was the primary trainer at that time. And there were hundreds of those out there, and we flew all over West Texas, Central and West Texas, learning how to fly that aircraft. That was primary flight. Advanced flight was at Fort Rucker in Alabama, where they taught us how to fly Hueys. And out of flight school, I was transitioned into the OH-6.
Fort Rucker, is that at Anniston?
It's in Enterprise, Alabama, about 100 miles, 110 miles north of Pensacola, Florida area. Yeah, not far.
Now, flying a helicopter is not like flying a conventional fixed-wing aircraft.
No, you have to be able to pat your head and rub your tummy at the same time.
I was going to say, it takes a lot of coordination.
It helps if you can walk at the same time. So
one hand does one thing, and
you're holding a cyclic and holding a collective and operating the anti-torque pedals, and it becomes an interesting proposition. Not everybody can do it, and they showed that to us.
Did a lot of the guys wash out?
In my time, I joined in September of '69. When we went up to Walters, there was about 800 of us. Of those 800, there was probably less than 100 of us that graduated flight school. They didn't need as many pilots at that time. They were weeding them out because they'd made the promise that you could try. But there was probably fewer than 100 of us that graduated from that batch of people. So it was a pretty exclusive group, and I was lucky enough to graduate in the top 10% of that group. That's why I got a transition en route Vietnam my first tour.
I was going to say, after you graduated or after you got your wings, how long was it before you ended up in Vietnam?
I took a transition class for a couple of weeks.
What does that mean?
That meant they taught me how to fly a new aircraft, and that's when I learned how to fly the OH-6. We took that and gunnery school with the minigun on the side of the 6th. And it was a unique thing because about a month later, after getting out of that leave, I was in Vietnam, early December 1970. I was stationed in the Mekong Delta at Vinh Long with the 7th Cavalry. The old cavalry,
the famous 7th.
The famous 7th Cav, Custer's boys.
Yeah.
I was with D Troop 3rd of the 5th. We were light horse. I was a scout pilot. We were the war wagons. We were the only air cavalry unit in Vietnam that wore the canvas hats, the white hats. And quite a unique bunch of individuals I got to fly with.
This is it?
Yes, sir. That was my first tour hat.
Yeah. What kind of work were you doing?
Well, I found myself in my first week, after a little bit of orientation, I was in a single pilot aircraft. I now was an aircraft commander with under 300 total hours. And I found myself going low level behind another aircraft like mine, flying trail 5-10 feet off the ground and engaging the enemy as a scout pilot.
How long did it take you to engage the enemy?
It didn't usually take very long because they didn't usually send us to where they weren't.
What was it like the first time you got shot at? I mean, was it totally different than what you expected?
It was an unbelievable action down at a place called VC Lake in the U Min Forest, and they'd been shooting down a whole lot of choppers down there, and that was one of the first things that I was a part of. It let you know that you were in the thick of things, and you really had to wake up real fast and pay attention. I was in the Delta at that time, and that was 4 Corps. 4 Corps was the region. There were 4 corps in Vietnam, South Vietnam, and that region was the first region that they took the American ground troops out, much like they've done in Iraq on August 31st. That was the start of the Vietnamization program.
So basically what you were doing is finding the enemy and pointing them out to the ARVN, and then they go in and...
What we would do is go track them down and engage them, start a fight. We would use the guns over top of us to engage them. We would try to ascertain what the size of the enemy element was, recon an LZ if we were going to put troops on the ground, and bring in the slicks, troop carriers, and drop off some ARVNs and work with them while they were developing the situation.
It sounds to me like your particular job was to be bait.
Hot dog on the end of a string was sometimes the way we were referred to, and I've had it said more than once that you mark most LZs with a burning loach. So, it meant that you usually got shot down in the middle of a landing zone, and that's where they usually would bring in the troops to stage from because we'd found the action.
Did you ever get shot down?
I never was shot down. I've been shot twice, but I've never been shot down.
Now you were pretty badly wounded a couple of times.
My first tour, May of 1971, I was shot in the U Min Forest. I had gone low level into a replacement group, maybe 150 bad guys with supplies and all. I got to about 100 feet going low level, and they engaged me significantly. By the time I'd hit the ground, I was trying to put a little distance between me and them. They seemed to be everywhere. So I took a round in the right door jamb. It went through my right foot, through my left ankle, and that bullet lodged in the aviation compartment of the aircraft. I still wear that bullet around my neck here, this bullet here.
Now, what shot that bullet?
An AK-47. That's a 7.62 Chi-Com round.
Chinese communist.
Yes, sir. So that wound ultimately made mobility significantly difficult for me. I came back to the States. It was an interesting time in '71. We were confused here in America, and we'd pulled most of the ground troops out of Vietnam, or were in the process of it, and I realized that there was still a lot of my friends still there. So I picked up a Watts line at the place where they'd stationed me, and I called Army Aviation in the Pentagon. A friend of mine was in charge of that, my mentor, General William Maddox. And General Bill, I gave him a call and said, "I'd like to come up and see you, sir. I think you need good men in Vietnam to bring the boys home." He said, "Brownie, you come up and see me." I went to the Pentagon because I grew up in the D.C. area. I took a little leave and went in to see him. He allowed me to go back, sent me over to Warrant Officer Branch, got my orders. I was transitioned into the Bell Jet Ranger, and I was back in country March of '72, less than 10 months after getting shot my first tour.
So they figured that it wasn't necessary for you to be able to walk very good if you could fly. That was the important thing.
I had a waiver for my mobility challenge.
Oh, did you?
I don't know that it would have worked well with the North Vietnamese, but luckily I never had to try.
Now, did you encounter a lot of protesters when you got back the first time?
I've been spit on in airports. I've been called a baby killer by some of the strangest folks. The last 40 years have taught me a number of things. But the one thing's taught me is we were confused at that time.
As a nation?
And there were people in harm's way. And I was going back to bring them back. I had no idea that in the March of '72 that the NVA were going to mount a conventional warfare and come.
North Vietnamese.
North Vietnamese. They came down conventionally with tanks, armor, heat-seeking missiles in '72, and a wonderful Marine Corps major who was deployed with the Vietnamese Marines, blew the bridges in North South Vietnam, so that the tanks couldn't descend any further. He blew the bridge on the My Chon River, and we set up the My Chon defense line at that time. So this was an unbelievable time in Vietnam of conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, no American troops on the ground except advisors, and about 22,000 of us as aviation assets in the 1st Aviation Brigade.
Well, I think what we learned as a nation from Vietnam is that you don't blame the warrior, because they're only following orders, and that's the difference that we have today from our troops coming back from
there's a great number of differences, but I believe some of the greatest lessons are yet to be learned. And I mentioned Vietnamization. That's a statement that's been dusted off here as of August 31st, when we brought all the troops out of Iraq.
Yeah.
You'll hear the news talking about the Vietnamization program. And what is the Vietnamization program? We'd have to know that to find out after August 31 what might be going on in Iraq with 4,500 Special Forces troops, Special Ops. Well, the Vietnamization program was designed by a wonderful fellow named General Earl Wheeler, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1964 to 1970. Arguably the architect of the Vietnamization program, something we'll do right now in Iraq and ultimately in Afghanistan. It ends up being resources to support an indigenous population to do their own defense. And that's what those 4,500 are doing in Iraq. That's much of what we'll do in Afghanistan, and probably are. It interfaces with the CIA portion of the war, Black Ops.
I want to move on because I know you're doing a great job at some things here at home for the last several years, but you received 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses?
Yes, sir.
And 1 Bronze Star?
I got a Bronze Star for my service in the Easter Offensive in '72.
28 Air Medals?
28 Air Medals for combat missions and 3 additional ones for valor.
And 2 Purple Hearts?
Yes, sir.
Now this last, on the second tour, you really got whammied.
Second tour, you never leave anybody behind. And we had a Cobra shot down right in the middle of a bunch of bad guys, about 8 clicks south of Da Nang, Maine. It was November 72, November 5th, 72.
A click is a kilometer.
Is a kilometer, 1,000 meters. So we were 7-8 miles south of Da Nang. We were blowing up anti-aircraft ammo. They'd massed to make an assault on the base, and we had caught them. But they'd shot down one of our Cobras, and we'd extracted one of the pilots, and we were still trying to extract the wounded pilot, William Miller III. He's now on the wall. We weren't successful to get him out. But in that attempt, I was shot in the chest. I watched, as I was lifting off, I watched a man raise up, shoot me with an AK, came up under my arm, blew a hole in the back of my arm, ricocheted off the armor-plated seat, into my chest, about a ½ inch in front of my chest. I still have the flight shirt that I was wearing when that occurred.
Oh, good. That ended your days.
That ended my combat career for that tour. I mean, I was decorated. I was brought back. I was assigned to priority air transport at Davison Army Airfield. At the time, the Marines and Army were sharing the presidential flight responsibilities, and I was being groomed a bit for the presidential flight. I was the Bell Jet Ranger instructor pilot for Military District of Washington, and my students were many of the gentlemen that were my command officers in Vietnam from the Pentagon and high-up FAA officials. It was a pretty good job. But in October of 73, the Yom Kippur Wars broke out in the Middle East, and a flight surgeon buddy of mine there said, Doug, I'm not going to keep you on flight status any longer because you can't pass the physical. So I started processing for medical retirement. And about a year later, I was awarded that at Walter Reed. They medical boarded me out of the military, 5 years medical retirement. Created a unique circumstances and education process for me.
Well, you, even though you're medically retired, you really haven't left the service.
Having been a Marine Corps brat till I was 19 and then be an Army warrant officer and helicopter combat pilot, you never take that out of you. And once you've been to war, you're never the same.
Well, tell me about your work here in Oceanside.
Well, I spent 33 years of my last career in the technology marketplace, and I made a commitment that I was going to do something for my community. And in working down here in San Diego with a nonprofit, I was lucky enough to run into another group called Vance out of Oceanside here, a wonderful operation.
And that's the
Veterans Association of North County. Mm-hmm. Here in Oceanside, the wonderful community of North County has been kind enough to donate the money in the building, the old police department over on Mission. And they've brought that building back up to spec and given it to us as a shell. And that's a wonderful thing to have done for our veteran community here. You don't see that happen everywhere, especially in this tough time. So I thank the community for that. Therefore, I think it was time for someone to come down here. My wife and I are coming down to bring additional resources and capabilities. And we're going to focus in on disabled veterans and the spouses. These folks in transition that have returned from Iraq and Afghanistan and left the military.
What are some of the problems that now you're involved, I know, with the Veterans Administration? We've got the hospital down in La Jolla, and now we've just opened a new facility here in Oceanside. Tell me about your...
Getting involved with Chuck Atkinson and Sandra Fichter was one of the greatest things in my life to ever do. They're with the Vance folks. They're officers of Vance. These folks have put me in touch with some programs that were being done at Claremont Graduate University, and they required someone that could spend the time and get some things done for them, source some disabled vets with PTSD, some spouses with PTSD. And I said...
Explain PTSD.
PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder.
In other words, and some of the older folks would know it as being shell-shocked?
It probably was initially a shell-shock condition that was related to the type of trauma that can shock you to create a disorder for you.
In World War I, it was called something else, but it's all basically the same thing.
When you're out in combat and that type of trauma occurs to you, there are things here in the U.S. and in the world that are equal to it, but it's constant in a war environment.
I've heard of guys coming back from Iraq and Vietnam, but Iraq and Afghanistan doesn't hit them until they've been here for a while, and then all of a sudden.
A trigger.
Yeah.
A trigger. It's when you're in war, things are very black and white for the most part, although they can be clouded. But when you come back here, there's a discussion going on in a free society that may have trigger moments for you that you don't understand.
Yeah.
And something occurs, something starts. I don't know that any of us know it. I've been living with those types of conditions for a long time. I don't know that they're a disorder in me, but I have had post-traumatic stress.
I was going to say, did you suffer it yourself?
I believe that I did, but I'll tell you this, the person who suffered it most was my spouse, my wonderful, beautiful wife of 30 years. And those are the things that you see, because with the conditions that they're looking at, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, spousal abuse, domestic violence, addiction, there are all types of these things that can be a problem for wounded or comprehensive combat casualties, complex casualties. These are things that you're taking medications, you're dealing with stuff that you're being transferred from the TRICARE healthcare system into the VA healthcare system. It's a transition that has to be made. You come back out here for special need. This is the area where my wife and I have found Vance to be very interesting, because here you have a place. San Diego County is the largest concentration of these in-transition veterans. And the Marine Corps base over here with the 1st Marine Division and the Wounded Warrior Battalion is some of the the finest people representing us in this country in the war. And this is a location that we can do a lot of things with. All my wife and I want to do is bring resources from outside the area to here, so that we can have all the resources that we might need.
What kind of resources are you talking about?
Working with Claremont Graduate University, we have access to people that are willing to do things around electronic umbilical. Now, what do I mean by that? Using the wireless technology tools like phones or PCs, you have the ability to communicate with folks at the time of need. So if you feel an anxious moment coming on, where you might have your stress level picking up, Claremont Graduate University is going to do a study with us that will start now, and we will continue this with many things, that will allow us to be able to do a gaming type or try different types of things to relieve those stresses and deal with them. Now, I'm dealing with them because we've also got programs for jobs and opportunity around virtual call center capability, so that we can make jobs and opportunity for these mobility challenged veterans and their spouses, or TBI sufferers, to be able to make a job for the spouse at home.
What's a TBI?
Traumatic brain injury. When that 500-pound bomb goes off next to you and it shakes that brain up, that concussion can create problems for you now and later. And some of these folks that require a great deal of care. The VA is doing some remarkable stuff with these people, but this is a lot of work. It's going to require a lot of other folks getting involved in these types of things.
People who have never been in combat, it must be very hard for them to understand what somebody who's been shot at and have been doing the shooting. That's a totally different human experience that not
Yes.
everybody can take it.
Well, they train you to defend yourself, and they do a pretty good job of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into a circumstance where you have to defend yourself, and then in war, they always taught us there were two types of people, the quick ones and the dead ones. Mm-hmm. And you don't have a lot of time to make decisions then, and it can get to be something you have to deal with, and it's very traumatic no matter what. Mm-hmm. People shooting at you. So it's a special type of a need. The VA provides a special type of a care for folks that you won't necessarily run into in the normal healthcare system. So,
what's the VA system, the facilities and the services here in San Diego County? What's it like?
I've run into some of the most wonderful people, and they just opened a clinic here in Oceanside and concentrated for North County. I see them for the kids that are and I call them kids. They're the kids in my family, partner. I tell you that. Yeah. These folks, I see them being given cases that they leave the medical facility and go out and take care of them at the home. They know the need that's there. They know that it's a huge need. And the one thing that I always really want to focus on is that VA Department of Veterans Affairs budget never gets any smaller. Yeah. As well as the TRICARE budget in the military never gets any smaller, because it turns out that we veterans, even if you haven't been exposed to war, veterans end up having a unique set of circumstances given to them, because you're not trained to defend yourself in any other way but possibly have to take others' lives. Yeah. And I tell you, I came back and had the most trouble with that commandment, thou shalt not kill, you know. Yeah. And when you try and put that in perspective in a kill or be killed environment, it still creates something for you to have to think about. Every one of those kids thinks about that, and now it's men and women.
Yeah, and I've talked to World War II veterans that they still are bothered with what they had to do during the war. Well, Doug, we've run out of time. I told you it would go really fast.
I tell you, I've really enjoyed this. Again, I want to thank the North County community for what they've done for the veteran community here, and we will bring resources from outside this. We're working closely with the VA to get things approved to deal with them, and we've got more things we'll be telling folks about through KOCT and public service announcements.
Well,
okay?
Thank you very much, Doug. Appreciate it. We've been talking with Doug Brown, who is moving down here from Huntington Beach. He's been doing a lot of work here in Oceanside, and we hope that we wish him a lot of luck. You can see Doug over at the Veteran Association of North County's new facility, the old police station here in Oceanside. I'm Tom Morrow. Join us again here next time on Living Legacies.